Good morning, everyone.
Good
Welcome
morning.
to our
Good morning.
Good
1970
morning.
Augusta Riot Observance History Subcommittee panel discussion. We'd like to share some information and some some conversation points that we were not able to share during the virtual tour. We hope you've been following with us this week as we've been sharing about the events from May 9th, 1970, all the way through to May 13th when Charles Oatman was buried. I'd like for everyone to give a brief introduction so that we know who's on the panel today. My name is Nefertiti. I am a local performer and writer, and I'm part of the 1970 Augusta Riot Steering Committee.
Corey Rogers with the Laney Museum. I'm a local educator and a historian, and I'm also a part of the steering committee and the history subcommittee for the 1970 Augusta Riot Observance.
I'm C. Shura. I'm a journalist, educator, and author, and I'm also on this history subcommittee. I'm also working on a podcast about the riot it's a project of Jesse Norman School of the Arts and Georgia Public Broadcasting.
John.
I'm John Hayes. I am a history professor here at Augusta University. Been involved in this work with the committee for about a year and a half now. We really started in December 2018. Lived in Augusta for 9 years now, and plan to live here for years to come.
I'm Sean Edwards, land bank employee, but more importantly, transplant to Augusta, history enthusiast, history subcommittee member, steering committee member, finance committee member, wrapped into this project because of the thought and vision of the original conversations to make sure that we were educated about our history.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So, I'm an Augusta native, and my family grew up in the Laney Walker Bethlehem neighborhood, but I did not learn about the riot until in my adulthood. So, the first question that I would like to talk about is when was the first time you personally became aware of the 1970 Augusta riot?
So I'll go ahead and begin. As a fellow Augusta native, I too had no idea that there was a riot or an uprising in the Augusta area in 1970. I was in graduate school. It was the summer of 1998. I was doing an internship at the Augusta Museum of History. My former principal at Davidson, Beverly Barnhart, was the president of the board of directors at the Augusta Museum. She called me at Georgia Southern and asked me if I wanted to do an internship as I was about to complete my studies at Georgia Southern. So I'm doing the internship, and Gordon Blaker, who at the time was the curator of the Augusta Museum, gave me 4 names to interview: Dr. Isaiah Ike Washington, Judge John H. Ruffin, Dr. James E. Carter III, and the fourth name was a guy by the name of Grady Abrams. So as I'm going to speak to these 4 individuals, Grady Abrams is talking to me about his book that he's writing. And in the course of that, he mentions that there was a riot in Augusta in 1970. I'm like, say that again, a riot and he goes into explaining the background of the riot, and it opened my eyes to a side of civil rights that people often forget about, that we've talked about within the context of this subcommittee, which is we think of civil rights as pre 1965. We think of everything as the nonviolent movement of the civil rights movement, but we don't think about what came after the Voting and Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. So what Grady was telling me was that there were issues within the Black community in Augusta that were festering, and eventually it exploded in May of 1970. And that was my first introduction to the riot.
Thank you.
If I can go next, I moved here roughly 11 years ago, and I moved to take a position at the university teaching in the communications department. I also had been in public radio for a long time, so I was still doing some freelancing. And there was a student by the name of Banks Pappas, if I recall correctly, who had done his documentary thesis for the program on the riot, and I was like, okay, what riot? And then I thought, well, okay, we totally, I need to pitch this as a story for GPB. And they said, sure, yeah, let's do it on this documentary. And then I watched it, and I was stunned by how I found it to be incredibly racist and in not quite inflammatory, but based in hyperbole. And there was an interview with Grady Abrams, but besides that, not a whole lot. And it just so bothered me that I said to the network, like, I don't want to do something on this. Let's just do something straight. And so I did an interview with Grady at that point, and from there started doing oral histories on the riot, because I felt like, how can we not be talking about this? How can this be something that's under the table instead of on it?
Yeah, so I first learned of it in, I guess it would have been probably January, February of 2012, when I was in my first year here as a history professor. And I say that with embarrassment because I had been in graduate school at the University of Georgia in the early 2000s. It's not even a 2-hour drive away. Pursuing a PhD in history, my focus is actually history of the US South, late 19th, 20th centuries. And again, I say this with embarrassment. In my years in that program, I had never heard of it. And this is in the same state. And so, moving here, I was, as a new faculty member, I was, new faculty members are invited to appear in different things. And I was part of a panel discussion as part of Black History Month. And I had no idea, or, sort of didn't know who they were enough to appreciate who I was sitting in the panel listening to, but it was Grady Abrams and Dr. Roscoe Williams, both of whom I now can appreciate their importance. But I was meeting them for the first time, and it was in that panel discussion that I first learned about, and actually Banks Pappas was on the panel, and then Hodges Usry, a filmmaker who's did a work on the sit-in campaign in the early 60s, an excellent film called The Steering Committee. That's when it first got on my radar. And then C, who's with us here, we became friends independently or just through the university, I guess, initially. The work that she did with oral histories and a series of live events, I guess now in spring of 2013, if I'm getting my dates right. And then my kind of wheels started turning in terms of just trying to make sense of it. But yeah, until I moved here, I had never heard of it. So.
Wrapping up. I haven't had the great levels of exposure as the other panelists. I found out about the riots just before the housing crash. At the time, I was still working in banking, but this time working for a nonprofit bank. And a tremendous number of my clients coming through my office, being the director of the Augusta region for that organization. Blacks were being considered or convinced to move to South Augusta. Whites were looking at West Augusta or Columbia County. And all of the growth that was being talked about in the city, again, pre-housing crash, was downtown. So it was like, well, why are people moving into the downtown area? And so I visited. And then I kind of saw why. It is extremely racially divided, economically divided, religiously divided. But the area of Laney Walker, Bethlehem, Turpin Hill, South Turpin Hill, that entire 15th Street corridor, Albion Acres, didn't feel like Old Town. It felt abandoned, it was desolate. And sometime after that, the city did make a commitment to try to reinvest in that community, but you had to go back to understand why had there not been investment in 30 years in the commercial and retail space? Why was it just grandmothers still paying property taxes amongst blocks of blight and dilapidation? And that forced me to start to kind of understand how you bring a neighborhood back. You got to understand where the neighborhood started. And so I began to have those necessary conversations with commissioners who approved the funding to revitalize that area. And some engaged me from the perspective of, well, this used to be a great area called the Golden Blocks. And I lived around the corner, or I had a store here. And so then that kind of got me started in understanding that this was a thriving community. And then this one cataclysmic thing happened and changed it. And I didn't, not being a historian or someone who does great interviews, it was just part of the job. But to know that one thing could completely change what a community became just was interesting. And I just kind of learned a little bit more from there. I don't consider myself to be at the level of my peers on panel, but it just kind of shook me a little bit. Because now in the 21st century, coming out of the housing crash, you had yet another obstacle for this community. And this community is representative of an entire culture, at least in this city. And it's the kind of thing that I needed to be able to be more involved in. So when this effort came around, it was like, okay, now I get to go full circle from just touching what this was and its impacts in my everyday life as career. And then I'm now being able to have a full understanding.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. Before we move on to our next question, now is a great time to add our guest, Harvey White. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Harvey.
Hi.
Harvey, are you able to hear everyone?
Yeah, sorry, I had y'all muted. I'm here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Harvey. So we're on our second question now, and I just like to just come out and ask. So we're discussing the 1970 Augusta Riot. What caused the riot? What is the context that this happened in, and why did this happen?
Years of kind of disenfranchisement. One of the things that I have kind of enjoyed from being on this committee is really getting to, riots don't happen because of one little thing. And I think and that's with any riot. So I just think this one has been like a microcosm of like a lot of different things, showing that like the death of Charles Oatman was a catalyst maybe, but not the root cause. Things have to be in place first for a riot to happen.
One of the things that I found, to kind of follow up on Harvey, one of the things I found sort of interesting is that in a way, you could see the storm clouds coming. It wasn't as if the death of young Charles happened and all of a sudden everything just exploded. Grady Abrams and other Black officials and Black leaders had warned people in Augusta for years, if not for months, prior to May 1970, that there were issues that were not being addressed in certain parts of the Black community, whether it be inequity in housing, whether it be paved roads, whether it be just the common everyday things that would allow for people to live in dignity and pride. And those things were not being addressed. And many white officials within Augusta, like what often happened in the 1960s, swept those things under the rug. And so the Charles Oatman travesty, as it was was the catalyst for these other inequities going on in Augusta society, and it just came to a head in May 1970.
I think there are a couple specific instances that I can add to Corey's overview and Harvey's. And for instance, just before the riot on May 4th, the city council held a meeting, and individuals from the Turpin Hill neighborhood, which is close to, just outside of the Laney Walker Bethlehem neighborhoods, went in front of the council and said, "We have been waiting 20 years for you to add sewer lines to our area. It's all around us. You've paved roads around us. You've added sewers around us. You haven't done this. And this is not just a, it's not just a smell problem. It is a public health issue." And the mayor's response to that was first to claim that he had been to Atlanta many times on this, and then to say, it hasn't been 20 years, it's been 17 years. And finally, he just left. He just left the meeting. And their coming was the result of Grady Abrams, who had recently joined the city council. And as he described it, was one of the people who was no longer interested in trying to work the system from within or behind closed doors. So I don't know how common it was that there had been people coming to those meetings and saying those sorts of things, but the minutes, if you read those minutes, it is startling how many people were there to speak to the issue and how completely disengaged the city council members were.
One of the people that we interviewed in the course of doing our research was a man named Mr. Wilbert Allen, and he founded Augusta's chapter of the Black Panther Party. And I think he put it most succinctly as to why it happened. His direct statement was, "People rebel when you kill kids and brutalize their parents." And so there's a long, long track record of racial violence, and more specifically, police brutality. Many stories of that preceded May of 1970. And so Charles Oatman's brutal death was kind of a crystallization of that long history. And then despite incremental gains won by the civil rights movement, especially the Voting Rights Act, so by 1970, in the 15 or 16 person city council, there were 4 African Americans on the council. So there have been incremental gains that are not meaningless. Having said that, the power structure was still overwhelmingly white. So all the county commissioners, the mayor, the sheriff, the police chief, every single judge, the superintendent of education, we can keep going on the list. All these offices were held by white men. And they just, to Steve's point, were not listening to Black grievances and taking them seriously. And when Black people pressed their demands, the power structure threatened violence. That came out very dramatically in the demonstration in the municipal building on the afternoon of May 11th.
Thank you. I'd actually like to share, if it's okay, I'd like to share a comment that someone shared on Facebook. It was a great area. I was born and raised there. I watched my community deteriorate. Thank you, Ms. Collins, for sharing that. That's heartbreaking. Just wanted to add that. But Sean, I believe you were about to speak.
I try to stay restrained. Everyone spoke to factors that created the circumstance for the riot here, but I think that the frustration that those residents in that era felt was just the vibe of Black people during that time. Augusta is not unique in that the minority community misinterpreted what the idea of integration would be. I really think that Black people thought it meant equity, and it didn't. It meant equality. It meant equal access to not equal ownership of. And so you press a demand against a power structure that had never decided it would relinquish a portion of its power. And inevitably, after banging your head against a wall, you pick up a hammer. That was it. You can only ask, cry, beg, yell, scream so often until you decide that I have to fight or starve. And I heard it said once that a hungry man will not die of starvation if he has the courage to go get a meal. If I can't provide for myself, I will take it out of your refrigerator. I can't starve because you said I'm supposed to die. And that community, which was Black folks in the 1970s and 60s throughout the nation, not just here, were left without the resources necessary to thrive. So you were left to starve. And some people got to a point where they said, we're not going to be without anymore.
I think Sean brings up a very interesting point of looking at the macro. You know, a lot of us are sort of looking at the micro of what was happening on the ground in Augusta. But if we took a step back and looked at sort of an aerial view of what was happening in the United States, I think that the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, in a way, sort of lulled us into a false sense of security. And so, you know, legislation is one thing, to pass legislation, but how do you change the hearts and minds of people? And it often takes much longer for hearts and minds to change. So there was still that resistance to change in 1966, 67, 68, and 69. And so, as John pointed out, even though there was legislation on the books in the South, there was a strong resistance to change, from mayors to governors to sheriffs. And so that attitude carried Augusta and other cities into 1970. That attitude of still treating African Americans and people of color as second-class citizens, it carried into 1970.
Yeah, and if I can just echo Sean's point, so like in 1967, relating it to the national dynamics, in 1967, 68, SCLC was planning the Poor People's Campaign. And it was actually during recruiting for that campaign with a side visit to Memphis that Dr. King was assassinated. So a few weeks before his assassination, he spoke here at Beulah Grove doing recruiting for the Poor People's Campaign. And that was trying to push the issue of exactly what Sean's talking about, pervasive economic inequalities that actually were worsening and widening between whites and blacks in coming out of World War II. And so, you know, that's on display in Augusta, but it's a national issue, certainly.
I think it's also important at this point just to at least briefly mention another layer of frustration within many segments of the Black community at this juncture in the 1960s. You have a war going on in Southeast Asia, and you have a disproportionate number of African Americans being drafted, you know, looking at our population in the United States, but looking at our draft numbers, it was a much higher number. So you had some Black leaders like Dr. King who were frustrated at we're fighting this war overseas, but yet you still have pervasive inequality at home.
Help me, I'm gone.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that,
you know,
context.
Can I add one more thing about that? That's a great reminder of how we also saw that frustration rise when Black soldiers returned from World War I and World War II. Red Summer, for those who are listening, if you're not sure what that is, it's the summer of 1919 when much of the country erupted in violence with whites attacking Blacks, and really for the first time, Black Americans fighting back. And it was terribly bloody, and it came on the heels of soldiers returning and Black soldiers coming back in poverty in their uniforms, proud of what they'd done, and then having white bus drivers, white pedestrians, just everywhere, Black soldiers encountering violence simply for wearing their uniforms. And we saw that again differently in World War II. So yeah, it just reminds me, Sean, that, you know, at Vietnam, it was that same thing of why am I suffering in my own country?
Yeah, and it's worth noting, Leon LaRue, who's a key figure in the drama of May 11th and 12th, he's a Vietnam veteran. Yeah,
Wow.
was a Vietnam veteran in the 1970s.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone, for that macro context. And I think if possible, if we could bring it back down to the micro, we've discussed meetings with civic leaders where the cries of the Black community went unheard and ignored. So can we discuss briefly what happened during the meeting at the municipal building, since that's kind of right before, you know, the first literal act of the riot? Can we talk about what happened during that meeting?
Sure. There's a meeting inside and there's a demonstration outside. And the meeting inside, there's a delegation of Black leaders. I think it's basically the same delegation that had been into the county jail at the demonstration the night before. We're not 100% sure of that, but certainly several of the same key figures. They meet with the county commission chairman and with the sheriff. And in my take on it, the commission chairman basically deflects the grievances into a discussion of basically greater efficiency in the carceral system. That's and as if like somehow that's actually a response to Black grievances about Charles Oatman. We just need a tighter ship. The sheriff, on the other hand, goes on the counterattack. So he doesn't do a deflection, he goes on the counterattack. And he announces that his investigation, which hadn't even lasted, you know, a night and a morning barely, into what had happened to Charles Oatman, that he had charged 2 other cellmates of Oatman with killing him. No one believed that. No Black person believed that, but that was the official mechanics of it. So that's going on inside the municipal building in the meetings, and then outside, I think there's a group waiting in expectation that maybe for once justice will be done. We have different numbers on that, anywhere from 300 to 1,000 people. Some sources we looked at tended to understate the number of people. So I think we're safe in saying between 700 and 1,000 people there. And I believe that they were getting harassed by passing white motorists. That was a key thing that happened in what became the Jackson State Massacre, which was just 3 days after the events in Augusta. Just routine harassment by white motorists passing by Black citizens. There are examples of that earlier in Augusta. And I think that's when some of the demonstrators got fed up. The meetings inside are dragging on longer, and they pulled down the Georgia flag, which had been changed in 1956 as in an act of defiance against Brown v. Board. It's very explicitly an anti-civil rights move, and they set it on fire. That's, you know, around the same time the delegation from inside is coming outside, and around the same time massive reinforcements from the police and sheriff's departments are being sent with shotguns drawn and pointed at the demonstrators. So I'll defer to someone else, but that's some of the stuff that's we're not there to what we call the riot just yet. That's some of what's going on in the immediate hour or so leading up to it.
Okay, and just for emphasis, right? This was a peaceful gathering to redress grievances with the government, and then the officers responded by coming out with arms. I mean, like bearing arms, right?
You can look at photographs. Some of them are published in the Augusta College yearbook of that year. you can't find a single gun on Black demonstrators. Did they have militant rhetoric, and were they determined to get an answer? Yes, absolutely. But if you look at who's there holding shotguns, it is white police officers. There's no ambiguity in the photographs. One of the few Black officers was Lieutenant Thomas Olds. He had actually conveyed to the group that morning that the only officers on the scene would be Black, and that they would not have guns visible. That was initially the case, but that changed. And even in the photograph, you can see Olds standing there. You can barely see his pistol, which is in his holster. The white police officers are there. It's impossible to miss the shotguns they've drawn in the photograph. So yeah, I mean, we have solid evidence of that.
Okay, and I read in one, I can't remember whether or not it was the Augusta Chronicle or a WJBF piece, but a local news network stated that the American flag was burned. Is that true?
No. They did pull it down from the municipal building, and Lieutenant Olds, just mentioned, and another African-American policeman, Frank O'Brien, got it back from the group and put it back up the flagpole. Then they tried to get one from a funeral home across Green Street, and that attempt failed, right? So yeah, what was stated is not true.
John mentioned something I thought was pretty important. He talked about the events the previous day on May 10th at the county jail. And I think one of the things that sort of sticks out to me about those events was the rapid ability for members of the community to mobilize, and especially Payne College. Payne College. Well, let me take a step back for a moment and just say this: the Black church was a very powerful force in terms of mobilization. And going back to the early days of civil rights pre Montgomery bus boycott, the Black minister was still a powerful force. So ministers like C.S. Hamilton and N.T. Young at Thankful Baptist Church, Hamilton was at Tabernacle. They were able to quickly mobilize for a variety of reasons, whether it be in 1962, boycotting the Augusta National Golf Tournament, or throughout the 1960s. Reverend Hamilton called for one of the first boycotts of the Augusta Chronicle in the early 60s. So these organizations allow for quick and rapid mobilization. So did Payne College. And so on May 10th, I thought it was very interesting that the students were able to come down in mass to show their support and solidarity for what was going on with the Charles Oatman murder.
I think it's also worth mentioning when we were talking about kind of police being armed and mobilized, and not only were they on the ground, but on top of the jail too, ready and armed. So just the image of a large group of peaceful, more or less protesters, being virtually surrounded, I guess, with policemen saying, we're ready for anything, kind of imagery.
Yeah, and just to pursue that for a sec, the demonstration in the jail the previous night, the same visuals are there. So there are about 400 demonstrators or so mobilized through the networks Corey was talking about, and just as Harvey noted, the jail has become a militarized space. There are even sheriff's deputies on the roof of the jail pointing shotguns. So what played out in the municipal building the following afternoon had a prelude that went a different direction the previous night, but that was a sign of things to come.
And I'll just follow up with that, John. One of the interviews that we did, one of the oral interviews, was with Reverend Cecilia Butler Johnson, who would go on to become the first female president of the Payne College student body during this era. and she was one of the protesters on May 10th. And, she recalled an incident of approaching a police officer that day, that evening at the jail. And her question to that police officer was, why do you want to kill us? Why is there so much hate, in you that you want to do these things to us? And I think that her response to that officer sort of encapsulated the spirit of that era and of that group. Let's keep in mind the notion of white officers with shotguns raised was nothing new.
Right.
This was pervasive for the previous 25, 30 years of civil rights. The difference here was that there were young black folk not willing to put up with this crap anymore. So you had a different mentality, you had a different mindset. And so the nonviolent protests of the early 60s was giving way to a much more aggressive stance. Stokely Carmichael may have embodied it on a national level, but you had those here in Augusta willing to enact it on a local level.
Yeah, that's an excellent point and essential. And it's when the delegation comes out of the meetings in the municipal building. So Grady Abrams reads the results, basically the commission chairman's response to the demands, which is again a deflection, a discussion of mechanics of carceral procedure. Then Leon LaRue reads the sheriff's response to their demands. When he reads that to the 700 to 1,000 people gathered in front of the municipal building, the response is electric. People are saying, "Burn, baby, burn. We don't want to hear that mess." At the same time, where things are going to go is still a little bit, it's unknown. Like in that moment, it's a very ripe moment. Several people make speeches, but it's Oliver Pope, who's a student radical at Payne, that makes a speech, says, "This is warfare. Tonight we're going to war." If we had to look at sort of where what we would call the riot begins, that would be sort of the beginning of it. But yeah, it's a militancy that says we're not going to take it. This is combat now. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question was there anything that you've learned over the course of your research that surprised you? Or have you learned anything that has impacted or changed you personally?
Well,
yeah, definitely.
ahead,
Please, Corey, you go ahead. You go ahead, Corey.
Well, I think that for me, I really didn't know what to expect going into this project when John and Pax and I met at Nacho Mama's in August of 2018. I really honestly didn't think that we would be here at this spot 2 years ago. I just didn't know what to expect. But I tell you this, the research that we've done and the camaraderie amongst the group in digging up the research has just been so enlightening. And I think because we have been so reliant, we as a society, as a community, we've been so reliant on allowing certain people to tell the story. And for about 50 years, organizations and businesses like the Augusta Chronicle have cornered the market on trying to tell stories like the Augusta Riot. What I like about this is that we've been able to take the narrative and expand it and give voice to individuals who remained voiceless since 1970. The Wilbert Allens of the world, the Mallory Millanders of the world. We've given them an opportunity to tell their side of the story, to balance out the equation about what happened. It's not as cut and dry as the establishment would lead you to believe. There are so many different layers to this story. And that's one of the things that I found out, that there's so many different side narratives that have been told over the years. So to answer your question, I guess to sum it up, working with this committee has sort of broadened my perspective on the events of 1970, and actually, this is just the beginning. I mean, our research continues, and there's so many other stories that we've yet to delve into, and so many other people that we want to talk to.
I'd like to, there's like a million things like personally, and then you just intellectually that I've learned from this. But one of the things that I think is probably the most relevant to everybody is the evolution of my understanding of what a riot is has just, it's so profoundly different than when I started. And when I started, I mean, like going back to say 2011, when I started doing research on the riot and doing oral histories. At that point, I was calling it a race. I was calling the Augusta race riots, plural and race in there. So a couple things. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand that by saying that I was doing something that we white people do a whole lot, which is give a skin color designation relevancy only to people of color. So if it were, you know, if it's the Boston Tea Party, we don't talk. It's not the white Boston Tea Party, right? It's not the. It's so there's that issue of also race. A race riot is a riot in which one color of people attacks another color of people. And that's a lot of what we saw in 1919. That is not what happened in 1970. That is not what happened in any of the civil rights uprisings. And then I think the other thing that I really was, I credit this to Dr. Akinyele Umoja over at Georgia State, because there are people in my circles, in my family, who I'm from Detroit, and they've said, like, how dare they rename the Detroit riot the Detroit Rebellion? It's a riot. What are you trying to do rebranding it? And Dr. Umoja was just really crystallized it for me. What we're talking about is an impromptu uprising, an impromptu rebellion. Impromptu rebellion is the phrase that he uses actually. And that is what, if we just say riot, we could be talking about what happened in Detroit for years on the eve of Halloween. We could be talking about, wasn't it Boston that had like a, they won like a sports title, and the whole city like started burning cars and stuff.
Yes.
That is a riot. When we look at the definition of a riot, it's a group of people being violent, but they're not, there's no purpose there. There's no rebellion against the structural violence, the stuff we think of violence in such a limited way. It's, I punch you in the face, not I refuse to give you sewerage, not I'm going to arrest you for whatever, right? That is violence. And these events were a response to that systematic, decade after decade, century after century event. And so, as you could tell, I'm really excited about that. But it's just one of the like million things that engaging in this research and collaborative work has taught me.
Okay, I want to just interject something really quickly before I forget. I'm a sports nut, and so when C brought up that point about teams after they win a championship and they kind of lose their minds, I often think about that. Just I'm at home watching TV and I'm thinking to myself, now why is it that certain groups in this country are allowed to jump on top of cars, overturn things, be intoxicated beyond belief in the middle of the street, millions of dollars of damage, but it's okay. You know, everyone's like, it's fine, you know, but that's just, you know, so that's my little sports thing. I was kind of thinking the same thing. Yeah. Harvey, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah.
Actually, if it's okay, Harvey, I'm so sorry, but really quickly,
I think it's going to be the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a comment for you, C, from Dr. Williams. C,
Yeah.
thank you for complicating our engagement with the word riot. Did the committee consider rebranding the Augusta response?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. We had hour upon hour of discussion of this in the 15-person steering committee, which, you know, involved many more people who have been participating in this community effort, in our 6 or 7-person history subcommittee meetings. And we talked about, well, what are we aiming for? Is this started as a protest, so do we call it that? Because often that's, one of our members pointed out that often the way that something began is how we call it. We talked about rebellion, and, you know, kind of looked into the definition of that, uprising. And I really wish that Sean Edwards were on the line right now to give his explanation. We went round and round on this, and
Sean is back. Sorry.
he is.
Pick it up, right on time.
Finish your thought.
No. I was gonna start trying to say what you said so beautifully, but you have to say it in fewer words than you did during that meeting.
I apologize. I got kicked off and have been scrambling, sending emails and text messages and chat and all that. So the dispute over the word riot, as C was saying, it landed, and I'll just start there. It landed at the need to stay riot because it is the direct engagement with the system. I think that group, and I believe that all of us believe that group of persons that took to the streets after the news of Charles Oatman's death had to have some physical contact and engagement with the system that we know as white supremacy racism. That at a certain point, oppression pushes you to a limit. And that if you do not directly engage and push back, it has the ability to be able to push you off of the board. Survival comes down to the ability to be able to directly engage. It goes to C's Boston Tea Party's example. It goes to Corey's piece about the celebratory events that are acceptable when it's white men destroying property. It's everything that is around you at all times that says that you are not equal. It's lack of sewer pipe in order to be able to dispose of waste out of your neighborhood. It is, you know, lack of resources at a school. It's confinement to a particular community that's overly policed to the point that it's called a plantation. It is existing in a second, if not third level of subclass, and then also being expected to deal with the physical violence and threat of physical violence that every day comes to you when just asking realistic, honest, open-ended questions of what happened to a child under your supervision. That's why riot had the state of word, because although it is racialized, we know who they mean when they say riot. In this perspective, that was necessary because it was Black people in this community who were pushing back. And although the push may not have had the end result that the initial group hoped for, because what you want is for the system to wake up to say, this is not the existence that we desire. Violent confrontation is not the hope of civilized people. It's the result of oppressive conditions on a civilized person, and that is their response to the need to continue to exist. That's your first natural instinct, is self-survival. You want to continue, but you want to continue in a way that is aligned with the society that you buy into. You buy property because you want to take care of it, not to destroy it. You pay taxes because you support an economy that's supposed to have reciprocity. You vote because you believe that if you award power to representatives, that they then will be able to bring resources back to you. These people engaged in this city in everyday life and in every way, but did so knowing that they weren't going to receive what their white counterparts were guaranteed to get. So at some point you say, you know what, I ain't gonna keep living like that and continue to be a part of the system. Well, in America, you can't completely disengage. At the end of the day, even if they throw you in jail or throw you on the street, you still have that American citizenship and some level of responsibility. You will be on a labor camp. You will be forced out of an area by the police. You still are affected by the system because you're on the land. So if you can't completely disengage, you have to force your way in to completely engage. That's all the riot was. It was the complete and total engagement of a disadvantaged community with a system that says that you're not really a part.
Harvey, I know that you were going to speak next, but I just wanted to share that actually I was one of the dissenters for using the term riot over uprising, because I feel very strongly about the need to vindicate our community of what we've already suffered, decades of harsh criminalization. And I felt, considering how the late Grady Abrams took a hit because of this event, and how there's just this residual shame and silence surrounding it. And I still feel conflicted about the word riot, because I'm like, that doesn't tell the whole story. But after hearing Sean's explanation, and after just sitting, because we also have different generations that are a part of the committee. So after hearing all of these different perspectives, I'm like, okay, you know what? If we don't call it an uprising officially, we can do the work in other ways to provide the vindication and the correction that's needed. So I just wanted to share that. But Harvey, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I think that as far as what our favorite things or things that we've learned, one of mine was actually kind of all of the wordsmithing that we did. I don't know. I wish we would have like timed it. But there were times where we would spend like hours over one sentence of our mission statement and things like that. But ultimately, words mean things. So that was, I think, necessary work that we had to do to make sure that we were all kind of on the same page there. One of the other things that I think that's very much worth mentioning for me was that it's a beautiful thing being able to work with living history and people who have lived things. As a historian, I'm used to like looking at diaries and going kind of back and doing the work. But if you don't have to do that, yeah, I think it's great. It kind of turns the whole, there's that old adage that history is created by the victors, and it kind of subverts that, and it doesn't have to be if you don't want it to be. If you like go out and do the work and look for those stories, yeah, I think it's.
I think also to kind of piggyback on Harvey's point, and what everyone has said thus far about language and the usage of what we call things. We spent a lot of time on what we're going to call this event, and to me, that's one of my takeaways. The fact that we were serious about this. This was not a cavalier discussion about an event that happened 50 years ago. We were really serious. I mean, it was contentious, it was painstaking, there were long meetings. I recall there was one steering committee meeting, I think like in an hour and a half, just language took up like an hour and 15 minutes of the steering committee. So we were serious about this. And let me also say this to kind of take this outside of just our committee to show you what others thought about what we were doing. The Historic Marker Review Board for the state of Georgia commended us, to a man, to a woman, commended us on the work that we did on our marker and on the riot, because at least we were having an in-depth discussion on protest, rebellion, riot, uprising. and they thought that that was a great start to a larger conversation. And we were just not passing it off, that we were actually taking the time to make a serious effort to think about what we're going to call this.
Corey, would you like to share that now? The representation of the marker?
Sure. So, one of the things that was sort of unfortunate in the current climate that we're living in is that we've had to postpone a lot of the events that were scheduled for the week of May 11th, 1970, or May 11th, 2020, 50 years to the day. One of the big triumphs for us was the acceptance of a state historic marker highlighting the events of May 11th and 12th, 1970. Now, let me just say this to put it in the proper context. Our marker didn't just pass muster. It was the top marker in the state. And we received very high accolades from many of our peers from around the state of Georgia, from public historians from all over the state who commended us on the work that went into this state marker. It will be unveiled in the fall of this year. We haven't set a date yet. And it will go at 535 Telfair Street, which is the municipal building. Now, let me say this. We made a decision as a subcommittee to place the marker on the Telfair Street side versus the Green Street side. Historical accuracy would dictate that it would go on the Green Street side, but we want the thousands of people that go in and out of the municipal building each day to see this marker, to remind them of what happened here 50 years ago. So it will go at the entrance to the municipal building on the Telfair Street side, probably in October of this year. But we're excited about it because it's a first step in telling our story physically in Augusta.
Excellent.
If I can add on the marker text that you just saw, you'll see different words. I mean, so it has the title where obviously Riot appears, but then in the text, you'll see a variety of different words used. All of that's intentional and intended to complicate and deepen what people hear when they hear the term riot. If I can say three things pretty quickly about sort of what I learned in the work of all this. The first one, and these are echoes of comments already made by really all of us. The first would be just thinking really carefully about language and what language is used depending on who is doing what. So, you know, to take a point made earlier, the person that went on our Wikipedia page and added the not true claim that they burned the American flag, right? That was an attempt to discredit what they were doing and say they were doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing, right? Let's even say that they succeeded in doing that, though, right? A different way to take that would be to say, what's that saying about the nation? So when Fannie Lou Hamer says in 1964, I question America, if they did torch the American flag, that would be saying the same thing. How messed up is the nation? And we could add, you know, in 1775, 1776, when a bunch of white folks pulled down statues of their king and put up new flags of their own, was that okay? Could they do that? Well, we call it the American Revolution, so here we are. So yeah, thinking very carefully about language and what language is used depending on who's doing what. The second thing would be just sort of sources of information. The oral histories we've done have been just vital, and just eye-opening, and also so poignant because you're talking, I mean, these are elderly people now who, you know, here they were in 1970. Those have just been essential in helping us correct what we've called the dominant narrative, the story that's out there that discredits the whole event. And I feel like I've learned so much from listening to people in the oral histories. And then I think the third thing that it didn't, I guess, surprise me, but it was, I just didn't know about it. And that is where it didn't quite get it. And that is the degree of activism leading up to 1970 and the degree of activism galvanized by May of 1970. So there are civil rights organizations, there are Black Power organizations that are talking about in 1970, before May, how do we truly implement gains of the civil rights movement? How do we address things that the movement has not changed? And then despite the kind of common view that, well, you know, law and order rode in, restored order to chaos, and then was just back to status quo. That's not true at all. The riot fundamentally shook the status quo. And that actually gave activists seeking change, it gave them leverage because the power structure was scared. And in this part, it's a whole new wave of activism that continues, you know, really one could say into early 1973 or so. There's a whole new wave of activism. That story certainly deserves to be told.
Oh, you know, one thing else, John, to kind of pick up on that, that's sort of interesting is that many of these activists that we've been highlighting and talking about and really getting to know through the oral histories, it's sort of interesting. Many of them, as high school and college age students, as activists in the 60s and 70s, would go on to become the future judges and lawyers of the 1980s and 90s. So I thought that pretty interesting. You know, Leon LaRue goes on to become a judge. Attorney Ruffin then becomes Judge John Ruffin, one of the most powerful appellate court judges in the state of Georgia. So I just thought there was this interesting transition, if you will, from that era to a more modern era, and how many of them didn't just talk about it, but they became a part and tried to affect change from within.
And yet there were also individuals who very much suffered for their engagement. There are those success stories, and then there are people like Grady Abrams who left public life. By and large, there's the individual who was involved in the speeches at the municipal building and had said, like, tonight we go to war. That statement resulted in his imprisonment for 2 years. There was positive change, but I think, and no one's saying that there wasn't, but I can't help but be cognizant of all of those. The way that the golden blocks is no longer golden. The suffering of individuals who lost their lives, or who were shot by police and had their lives shortened as a result of that, or simply have lived with the shame of being having their message quashed in another violent fashion.
Agreed.
So, Sean, unfortunately, we lost you when we were discussing the different things that you might have learned, or anything that has changed your perspective since you've been researching or have been a part of this project. Would you like to share anything about that?
Sure. One, I definitely say, and I've said this to both C and John, and maybe a couple of others in the larger steering committee, it has been an honor to meet honest white people. Folks that can acknowledge the fact that there is an unjust system, regardless of what you call it. You can say that it affects people of color, you can say it affects minorities. I say it is the direct opposition, anti-Black oppression. But whatever your terminology is, to say that there is a system that privileges Caucasians over others. You fill in your blank on other. But not only that it exists, but also that it's unchanged since its creation. It's morphed some, it's more sophisticated, it's more refined. But recent events, look at the news, shows you that it is still very much so active. It is engaged in every area of human activity, and it affects the other at all times and in all ways. And so to meet folks that say, I not only acknowledge this thing that provides advantage to me over you, but also want to do something about it, understanding what that is from the standpoint of sacrifice. You're essentially asking a mother and son and fathers with children to take away advantage from future generations to offer you equity, or at least opportunity to equity. And that's hard. That goes to the whole ideology of white guilt and white shame, but it also pushes past that to say, are you brave enough, and I use the term with them, to be John Brown? Are you willing to sacrifice what you are naturally entitled to because of the structure of this system so that I could have what I was promised by God the opportunity to get? And a lot of people say, you know what? That's a big thing. That's a lot to take away advantage in a system that is designed to provide it, to take away advantage from future generations of my family, my grandchildren or great grandchildren, to give your children and great grandchildren an opportunity to be whole. I'm not mad at the person that says, I don't know if I have that in me. But I'm surprised at how many people that I've met through this process that don't have to be on this side of the fight that actually do have it in them. And they stand out when you have conversation because they completely engage, they completely immerse themselves, and they often voice that courageous position. As a black man, I mean, we have no choice but to stand in this gap. As a black woman who stands by a black man, you ain't really got no choice either. But when you're on the other side and can choose to be on the other side comfortably and quietly and complacently, but come on this side, that was extremely important for me. That was surprising to me. I'm not someone who walks around and believes that all white people are racist. That would be ridiculous. But I know that the tremendous number of white people in this country that could end racism tomorrow have not engaged the racist system that still exists. So to meet folks who say, I understand where you're going through and not leave me with empathetic feelings, but also actionable steps that they're willing to take with me, that's my biggest takeaway.
Nefertiti, Sean just invoked the name of John Brown, so we know where this might be going.
Yeah, do we really want to publicly reveal our own
Well,
now that Sean Stokely has spoken?
Hey, that's good now. Oh, goodness.
Listen, we about that life. We about
there
that
you
life.
go.
So, in light of everything we've discussed and providing the historical context that's so been needed, and answers to some questions that we've been receiving, now what I'd like for us to share is, what are we going to do? What are we up to? What's in the plans for the future? What are our initiatives? Can we share a little bit about that?
Well, I'll just say this briefly, and I'll let Dr. Hayes kind of follow up with something much more extensive. But from the historical standpoint, the plan had always been not to just stop at a historic marker, that there was too much to tell as it relates to the events before, during, and after May 1970. So John came up with a great idea of expanding the 5 or 6 page narrative that we wrote for the marker into a booklet. And so we're hoping that that will be available to the public in the very near future, and then maybe even something beyond a booklet. Um, I can say that it's well overdue that there are writings about the riot in different venues, from the New Georgia Encyclopedia to the Georgia Historical Society. We need to continue to get the narrative out there. So kind of going forward, I'm hoping that we can continue to talk more about it, write more about it. Pretty sure C is going to talk about her amazing podcast and other things like that. But the future looks great in terms of expanding our discussion and our narrative on May 1970.
Okay. So, Dr. John, before you step in, I just wanted to say, because I'm going to have to hop off here really quickly, I just wanted to say, please don't forget to share about the video oral history videos that we're going to be sharing soon. And please don't forget to share about our efforts to get this history into local school curriculum. And was there anything else we were working on? I can't think of anything else, but I wanted to make sure that those things were shared before I leave. So thanks, Corey.
Thank you, Nefertiti.
Of course.
John, did you want to expound a little bit on the booklet?
Yeah, so I mean, you saw the text of the historical marker. That's 135 words, and earlier we spent hours discussing those words. You can only hint it's so much of a very complex event, and so the podcast that C is working on we'll talk about, and then the booklet or putting things out there that people that want more of the story than you can condense on a historical marker. It's there for people. And to I guess Nefertiti's original question, I've been so focused on just sort of getting the history right, what actually happened in 1970. As a citizen of Augusta, certainly I think about the resonance of that for today, absolutely. But I think just if we don't tell the truth about a past trauma, we just never really get past it. That's true for an individual, a family, a community. And so a starting point has to be trying to tell the truth about what actually happened. It's an open wound in the community. And if people wonder, why is the community, why didn't this happen, et cetera, well, there's a reason for that. There's an event that's in living memory of many, many people in the community. And so, yeah, education is a key part of it. Education is not the only thing, but kind of where do we go from here? Those are conversations to continue. Absolutely.
The videos that Nefertiti mentioned, these are some of the people we spoke with about the riot agreed to come into Mustard Seed Studio. Thank you so much, Mustard Seed. And record, do a video as well as an audio recording of their experience during that time. And so Nefertiti has been hard at work editing those so that snippets of them can be put online. And then in addition, the videos that we've produced, the virtual walking tour, will be put together. Is that right? As one? Yeah. So those are those couple of things. On my end, I have been steadily working at making a podcast that's going to be about a total of 6 hours of content. It will cover from the life and death of Charles Oatman, the causes and circumstances leading up to the riot, the broad events of the riot, and then the deaths of those 6 individuals who were killed by police, shot in the back. And then we'll also talk about the aftermath. And a part of the project has been working with my students from Jesse Norman School of the Arts. About give or take 10 students have been involved in learning about the riot and doing interviews on occasion, doing site visits with me. And so they're part of the content in the podcast, but we'll also at the end of the series hold an event where we basically have a discussion with them and the public. So that'll come out in July. It's been, you know, productions have been held up as a result of COVID, which is why we didn't release it in May. But at the same time, it's allowed me to turn them from half an hour episodes to hour-long episodes. So they're really engaging, and if we're lucky enough, GPB Education will have a little bit of time to put together material for teachers as well, teachers across the state. So it's been a great partnership, and excited to release it into the world. We have some other education stuff going on that I haven't been working on specifically. I believe it was Corey and John, is that right? Who were working in talks with the Richmond County Board of Education to, you know, use the booklet and our other materials for 8th grade Georgia history.
Right. Yeah, Corey's involved in early talks on that. Yeah. So just Nefertiti has left us. Harvey and Sean, do y'all want perhaps a final comment, and then I think we'll perhaps conclude the video.
Sure. I just wanted to say, as far as like where things go, I think we all belong to kind of individual organizations as well. So I feel like we are all now, even more maybe than we were before, equipped to be kind of advocates in our specific organization. I know that I am here at the Augusta Museum of History, kind of working on, incorporating those narratives into our galleries more and into my tours and things like that more.
I apologize. I've got a sound delay, so I had to listen to Harvey via the YouTube page. Now let me pause that. I would say next things, although not directly associated with this effort, but something that has to happen next is the reinvestment. So my eyes open through this project to a much greater extent, but the Golden Blocks project, the partnership between Arts Council, Lucy Craft Laney, Museum of Black History, helped me to also see that there's value still in that community, even though the commercial retail industry has never returned. I think that there has to be more conversations about the racial dynamic that created such a disadvantaged position for Black business owners there. I see pieces of that continuing through this day, where the SBA loans, now that they're doing some reporting of PPPs that rolled out, have not supported Black businesses to the extent that they thought that those monies would get to, even though when you use the term minority, the numbers look better. But we've got to do something in this city that's going to be able to make everyone equitable and whole. I understand about competition. I get it. This is capitalistic America, and that's the way that it should be. That is a really sound economic system. But simultaneously, we're seeing a group that consistently gets the buckets thrown on them, and it's time to kind of dry them off some. So I'm hoping that all of the work of this group and every subcommittee under it helps to light a fire back in my community to say that we do have a place in Augusta, that we are a part of Augusta's greater history and America's greater history. And I'm not talking about bootstrapism. I do believe that there is a debt that is owed that should be paid that starts with reparations. But I am talking about the re-engagement of our talent, our gifts, and our efforts in order to be able to better our city. And not just for ourselves, but for everyone that is a transplant here, that's a transient here, and that's a native from here. We have something to contribute and have always contributed. We need to see return on that contribution, but we also need to continue that investment has to be in the areas where we congregate, the areas that we populate, and the areas that we control. So I hope that coming out of all of this, as folks go back and look at the virtual tours, that they re-engage with the website, that when the book is ready, that they hopefully purchase it as opposed to just getting a copy of it. I want to start to see the change. And some folks are going to fast forward light years because their light bulb's going to go off. And some people it's going to be really small. But I really want to start to see the change, the needed level of engagement, as John referenced, to having honest conversation that brings you to a point of real decision making and what kind of person you're going to be. I understand the system, but you chip away at the system starting with your own heart. And it's not a spiritual transformation, and I'm not talking about any type of transcendentalism or anything of that nature. I'm talking about the decision to be a person that has decency and morality and practices that in everyday existence, looking at human beings as human beings. That's next step for me, is to challenge folks to be that.
That's a great closing benediction, Sean. Thank you. I'm seeing a message from Corey that he has the technical difficulties. Do we want to, any final comments, or do we want to wrap it up? And thank you for the audience, for live audience, for tuning in to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank y'all. I would say next.
So I go home and literally change clothes. My wife and so said, where were you? I'm going up here. Oh, she saw the way I was dressed. And when I got back up there, soon as I got there, all of a sudden they said, we don't want to hear that mess. Next thing I know, the flag on the burning. And we don't hear that mess. We don't hear that mess. And it was like a swarm of bees. All of a sudden, just ooh, they turned and start swarming downtown. That's when I'm saying, this is getting ready to get ugly. So I went back home when I saw they were going. I was in my car, so I don't know where they're going, but I'm not going down there. And when I got home, by the time I got home, they say all had broken loose. I mean, it was crazy. Then me and my young mind, I said, well, I'm supposed to be out there. You know? So I get me, my partner had 20 gauge and 12 gauge shotgun, cross belt, a rabbit toe hat up inside. I mean, I strapped down. I'm going out. I go out, and when I went out, it was crazy. I mean, police all over the place. And when I got up, right around night, matter of fact, behind the ambulance, and my car just stopped. And I couldn't get it crunk. I said, oh wow, I'm stuck out here. You know, with this ride and all this stuff going on. A friend of mine, Robert Reed, stayed right next to the club. And I said, Robert, can you take me to my parents' house on 15th Street? Okay. Because I'm concerned about them. He said, well, I'm going to give a manor and to see about his mom, check on his mom. But he said, now, I can take his boys to give a manor. I said, well, okay, get me give a manor. I can go right up here and go on Payne campus. And he did that. I went up here, went on Payne campus. Yeah. And when I got on campus, you know, everybody was all scared. All the kids were out in the hall, didn't want to sleep in their rooms. They was afraid somebody was going to throw fire bombs and all of this stuff. And when the security guard saw me, a friend of my dad, he said, you can't stay on campus with that. You know, you're going to have to go off campus. He said, but Emmett Street, you can just drive up in Emmett Street there. Then that was the dorm right there. You can drive up. So he said, if you want to help, just go off campus on Emma Street. I said, no problem. And I went and I sat out there until it got late. And I was satisfied that nothing was going to happen. I said, I need to get out of the street.